Some people hold power without uttering a word. They don't chase, plead, or explain. They simply withdraw and the room feels it. People shift, energy shifts. Suddenly, those who took them for granted are scrambling for proximity. This isn't manipulation, it's psychology. When something becomes less available, we instinctively value it more. But we're rarely taught how to use that truth for our own well-being. Instead, we're trained to overextend, to always reply, to always show up, to always explain. When you give too much of yourself, your presence, your kindness, your energy, it becomes expected, not appreciated. People adapt to your constant yes. Your generosity becomes a background hum. But the moment you pull back, even slightly, people feel the void. They ask if everything's okay. They wonder what changed. They feel unsettled not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped overfunctioning. This is where transformation begins, in the pause between stimulus and response, in the breath you take instead of the automatic reaction. That breath, that stillness, it's not nothing, it's power. You start to realize that silence is not retreat, it's strategy. Silence disrupts cycles that rely on your energy. When you stop participating in dysfunctional patterns, they begin to collapse. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to stop feeding a dynamic with your attention. Even in something as small as a group chat, when you delay your reply, when you don't explain or justify your silence, sends a signal. Your absence speaks volumes. That shift in presence reclaims a part of yourself. You start to see that the endless explanations were never necessary. Your boundaries don't need approval. Your emotions don't require validation. Stillness recalibrates relationships without confrontation. In every connection, there's an invisible contract of emotional access, a silent agreement about how much of yourself you're expected to offer. Often, you're not aware you even signed it. You're the fixer, the comforter, the emotional sponge. You believe you're being yourself, but what you're offering is a curated version trained to keep the peace, avoid discomfort, and be useful. But usefulness is not the same as connection. People may be responding to your predictability, not your presence. When someone knows exactly how to get a reaction from you, when to poke, when to guilt, when to press, they're not engaging with your soul. They're pulling a lever they've learned to use. And every time you respond as expected, you reinforce the dynamic. It becomes a loop they rely on, and you feel trapped inside. But the moment you choose not to react, you interrupt the pattern. They prod, and you say nothing. You don't defend, you don't perform, and the script falls apart. Because what they relied on wasn't your love, it was your reaction. Your emotional labor has become their currency. When you stop offering it for free, everything changes. People don't fear your anger, they fear your neutrality. They fear your distance. When you stop showing up in predictable ways, they lose their sense of control over you. But that's not a loss, that's clarity, and it starts to bring you back to yourself. Most people don't respect your time. Not really. They respect your access, your usefulness, your readiness to help. But your time, your sacred, limited, soul-aligned time that's rarely acknowledged. You've been conditioned to auto-renew your energy like a subscription. Always giving, rarely pausing to ask, do I even have anything left? Every time you override your needs to attend to someone else's emotional emergency, you spend a piece of your essence. You cancel your quiet night. You skip the rest your body pleaded for. You pick up the phone. You nod. You soothe. You shrink. They feel better, and you feel depleted. Your body is energy. Your thoughts and emotions carry a vibrational imprint. High frequencies, joy, clarity, boundaries. Low ones, guilt, resentment, depletion. When you say yes to something your soul didn't consent to, your energy lowers. Not figuratively, literally. You tune yourself to someone else's chaos and your system adapts. You become the emotional frequency of the room you're trying to regulate. And here's the trap. You begin to believe that being drained is a form of love. That saying yes to avoid guilt is moral. That collapsing your boundaries is kindness. But it's not. Every unaligned choice chips away at your self-respect. And fractured alignment becomes chronic imbalance, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. This is when burnout surfaces, that heavy, numb, disconnected feeling. The quiet dread of living a life that doesn't feel like yours. And the tragedy is few will ever ask what it cost you to show up. They'll just assume you had it to give. But here's a deeper truth. Your time is not a public utility. Your nervous system is not on demand. You were not born to be emotionally available to anyone who asks. You were born to tune in to your own rhythm, your own energy, your own becoming. When you begin to protect your energy, people might call you distant, cold, selfish, but boundaries were never meant to please others, they're meant to preserve you. When you withhold explanation, when you stop apologizing for prioritizing yourself, your silence becomes a mirror, not to punish, but to reveal. Because here's what often goes unnoticed. Your overfunctioning kept others comfortable. It shielded them from their own discomfort. Your usefulness masked their lack of effort. And when that performance ends, when you step out of the role they relied on, they feel disoriented. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. You begin to notice how certain relationships only work when you're giving more than you receive. When you're understanding, patient, self-sacrificing. You were praised for being strong, but that strength was never for your sake. It was a requirement. You were easy to love as long as you stayed small enough to be manageable. Carl Jung called this the confusion between persona and self. The persona is the social mask you wear to function. It's the agreeable version of you that adapts to be liked, to be needed, to be safe. And for many of us, we wore it so long, we forgot it was a mask at all. You became the reliable one, the calm one, the helper. And maybe no one ever asked what existed beneath the surface. Maybe you never did either. Because performance becomes identity when we mistake being useful for being loved. Eventually that mask becomes heavy, you don't know where it ends, and you begin. You find yourself exhausted by kindness, burdened by loyalty, disoriented by the roles you never consented to but still perform. This is the subtle erosion of self, the slow disappearance that happens when you're only valued for your function, not your essence, not your complexity, not your humanity. And the more you're rewarded for that function through praise, affection, belonging, the harder it becomes to let go of the role. You feel trapped in your own performance. Because if you stop playing the part, what happens? Will they still love you if you're not useful? But love based on utility isn't love, it's exchange. It's unconscious manipulation dressed up as connection. Because the second you set a boundary, the tone shifts. You're no longer easy, you're no longer agreeable, you're inconvenient. And that's the moment of reckoning. The moment you realize that some people were only loyal to the version of you that served them. That your self-sacrifice was never seen as a gift, it was expected. That your silence was mistaken for agreement. That your presence was assumed, not cherished. This is when you start remembering. Remembering the quiet parts of yourself that existed before performance. The parts that never needed to earn space. The parts that simply were. Sacred isolation is how you reconnect to them. Not isolation as withdrawal or bitterness, but intentional solitude, the kind that lets you hear your own voice again. At first, the silence feels unfamiliar, even lonely. But if you stay, if you listen, you'll begin to feel something rise. A self untouched by applause, a self whole before the world told you how to be. You stop needing to prove, to explain, to chase. You realize the peace you've been searching for never lived in validation. It lived in your own permission to be exactly who you are when no one is watching. You begin to unlearn. You start saying no without guilt. You sit still without shame. You understand that discomfort is not danger, that solitude is not punishment, it's a return. And from that space, your energy changes. You're no longer attracting people who need to be saved. You're attracting those who respect your presence. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are when you stop doing. This is the rebirth, not of a better version of you, but of the truest one. The one that doesn't adjust to fit the room. The one that doesn't dilute to avoid rejection. The one that knows its value isn't in output, but in essence. Letting go of overfunctioning feels like grief, because you're not just losing people, you're losing patterns, identities, lifelines that once kept you connected. But connection without authenticity is suffocating. And distance, when it leads you back to yourself, is liberation. You learn to feel the difference between closeness and codependency, between resonance and chaos, between love and control. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop mistaking being needed for being seen. And in that clarity, you choose stillness over reaction, presence over performance, truth over tradition. Silence becomes sacred. Not because it hides your truth, but because it refines it. You no longer need to explain your peace, you just live in it. You no longer defend your boundaries, you embody them. Because not everyone is meant to understand you, and the ones who are won't require a performance. They'll recognize your energy without needing a translation. When you begin choosing peace over reactivity, something radical happens. You realize that most arguments aren't about truth, they're about control. They're tests, invitations to prove your worth, your loyalty, your predictability. And every time you respond out of habit, anger, defensiveness, urgency, you abandon your center. You give away your power in pieces. Carl Jung warned that unchecked reaction is a sign of fragmentation. We think we're responding to the moment, but we're often just reenacting old wounds. Your body tenses, your breath shortens, your mind races. You feel the heat rise before a single word is spoken. What's happening isn't weakness, it's memory. The child in you, the part that once felt dismissed, unheard, unsafe, begins to surface. In that moment, the trigger feels like truth. The story rushes in. They don't respect me, I have to defend myself. But this urgency, this desperate grasp to be understood, is rarely about now. It's about then. And if you can pause just long enough to feel without becoming the feeling, you create space. Space between the old wound and your present power. That space is where sovereignty begins. Reactivity is a reflex. Sovereignty is a response. One is survival-based, the other is self-possessed. Sovereignty doesn't mean you don't feel, it means you don't collapse. It means you recognize the emotion rising, but you stay conscious enough to decide, is this mine? Is this ancestral? Is this automated? When someone pushes your buttons and you don't respond as expected, you break the cycle. Not just in that moment, but in your entire lineage. You are no longer being moved. You are moving. You start to recognize when conversations aren't real, they're performances. When questions aren't inquiries, they're manipulations. When concern is just control with a softer face. You notice how certain dynamics exist only to drain you. You no longer confuse stimulation with connection. You learn that not every message deserves a reply. Not every invitation is worth attending. Not every conflict requires your energy. And your silence, it becomes strategic. Not passive, not avoidant, but deeply intentional. Lucid silence is the moment you observe without reacting. You feel everything, but transmit selectively. You protect your energy not by closing off, but by refining what gets your light. You begin to sense the difference between real presence and projection. Because here's the truth. When people project onto you, they aren't connecting with your being. They're reacting to a version of you that serves their story. Their unresolved wounds cast you in roles you never chose: the strong one, the calm one, the savior, the scapegoat. And the moment you stop performing, the projection collapses. That collapse is rarely met with grace. It's met with confusion, disappointment, even hostility. Because when someone loves the version of you that softens their discomfort, your growth feels like betrayal. But you are not here to stay digestible. The more you reclaim your center, the more you see the patterns. How often you over-explain, how quickly you justify your needs, how drained you feel after every clarifying conversation with someone committed to misunderstanding you. And slowly, steadily, you stop trying to be understood in places that cannot hold you. You start speaking less and listening more, not to others, but to your own nervous system. You notice what tightens, what contracts, what expands. You choose environments where your presence doesn't require translation. You let your silence speak louder than your justifications ever could. This is not detachment. This is energetic discipline. It is recognizing that your emotional bandwidth is not infinite and treating it as sacred. You no longer give your inner world away like a free sample to anyone who shows interest. You become selective with your access, not out of bitterness, but clarity. Because the more deeply you respect your own energy, the more life reflects that back to you. Boundaries stop being something you explain, they become something you are. You don't have to say, "I need space," you just take it. You don't have to say, "That hurt me," your absence reveals what words can't. You don't have to convince someone to treat you better, you simply stop showing up in places that require convincing. And the beautiful paradox? The less you explain, the more clearly you're seen by yourself first, and then by others. You stop performing worth and start embodying it. Stillness becomes strength. Not the passive kind, but the kind forged in fire, the fire of your old reactions, your ancestral patterns, your unmet needs. You rise not because you finally shouted loud enough, but because you stopped speaking from the wound. And when people try to pull you back into your old shape with guilt, silence, withdrawal, you no longer contort. You let their discomfort stay with them. You don't shrink to soothe it. You don't chase to resolve it. You've learned that true belonging doesn't require you to become smaller. Instead, you hold your ground not out of defiance, but from deep alignment. You've remembered who you are when no one else needs you to be anything. And in that remembering, your life begins to rearrange. Sometimes we call it heartbreak, when what we're really feeling is the disintegration of a role. The identity we wore so long to be needed, loved, accepted. And when that role dissolves, what's left can feel hollow until we realize we're finally making space for who we truly are. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of moving beyond the mask we show the world. This path is not about creating a new identity, but shedding the false ones. It's not about adding more, it's about subtracting what was never you. You begin to see it clearly. How often you settled, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of being too much, fear of being alone, fear that if you stop performing, you'll disappear. But you don't disappear, you emerge. You realize that your life has been shaped by emotional muscle memory. You said yes when your body whispered no. You stayed quiet when your truth was ready to speak. You performed calm while drowning inside, and you thought this was love. You thought this was strength. You thought this was who you were, but you were surviving. When you stop surviving and start choosing, people notice. The ones who only knew the version of you that made them comfortable might leave. Let them. That exit is not abandonment, it's alignment. When people fall away after you stop self-sacrificing, that's clarity, not loss. That's the universe responding to your return to self. This is not revenge, it's reclamation. You are no longer performing your worth, you are remembering it. The difference is everything. One seeks applause, the other requires solitude. And in that solitude, something sacred happens. You begin to rebuild, quietly. Not with grand declarations, but with small refusals. You stop answering out of guilt. You stop explaining your silence. You stop overgiving to avoid discomfort. You let things go not because they're unimportant, but because they were built on the false idea that love must always cost you something. Real love doesn't feel like erosion. It feels like expansion. It doesn't require self-abandonment. It welcomes your whole self, messy, honest, evolving. And if your presence feels like a disruption to someone's illusion, then so be it. You were not born to maintain comfort for others at the expense of your own becoming. You learn to love yourself not in spite of your edges, but because of them. You honor your inner yes and your inner no with the same respect. You begin to trust your intuition not as a feeling, but as a compass. You stop asking, will they still love me if I change? And start asking, will I still love myself if I don't? That's the moment everything shifts. Letting go doesn't always look like conflict. Sometimes it looks like peace, like no longer needing to argue, like realizing your silence communicates more than any explanation ever could. Like knowing that some people aren't meant to understand you, and that's not a problem to solve. It's a truth to accept. You release the need to be palatable. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's story. You walk away not to punish, but to preserve. And in that space, something ancient stirs the self you buried beneath compromise, beneath roles, beneath performance. And now you're meeting them again. Not the better version, the real one. The version who doesn't perform ease to avoid tension, who doesn't rush to fix what isn't theirs, who doesn't apologize for their own awakening. You learn that your life isn't measured by how well you're understood, but by how deeply you live aligned. You begin choosing rest over drama, integrity over people-pleasing, depth over attention. You speak less, but say more. You do less, but feel more. You need less, but are more. This is not regression. This is return. You no longer chase clarity in chaos. You no longer reach for people who leave you emotionally hungry. You are no longer emotionally available to people who only know how to take, not out of coldness, but out of wisdom. You've learned the difference between being generous and being exploited. And here's what nobody tells you. Your detachment isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of real love. The kind that doesn't come from proving, but from being. The kind that doesn't demand access to your energy, but respects your space. The kind that doesn't start with, "What can I get from you?" but with, "How can I meet you where you are?" And the first person to offer that kind of love is you. You begin to keep your own word. You don't override your needs just to keep peace. You let people misunderstand you. You let the distance grow. You sit in the unknown, because now your allegiance isn't to being liked, it's to being whole. You start living for resonance, not recognition, for alignment, not applause. And slowly, without even trying, the world begins to reflect that shift. People who once needed your performance fall away, those who feared your silence drift. But others begin to arrive, those who understand your stillness, who speak in presence, who recognize your energy without explanation. Because when you stop needing to be understood, you make space for being truly seen. Stillness becomes your power source. It's not avoidance, it's sacred preservation. You don't need to fight every battle, explain every decision, or defend every boundary. Your energy speaks for you, and the ones meant for you will hear it. Lucid silence becomes a language. You use it when words would cost too much, when clarity requires no explanation, when protecting your nervous system is more important than winning the argument. You don't speak to prove. You speak when it amplifies truth, and stay quiet when noise demands performance. This is emotional maturity. You're no longer pulled into every drama that echoes your past. You stop entering conversations designed to bait you. You know the difference now between someone seeking connection and someone seeking control. You feel the energy behind the words, and you respond, not with defense, but discernment. The most radical thing you can do isn't to become louder. It's to become more precise, more intentional, more unbothered by things that used to wreck you. You no longer match energy. You maintain your own. Triggers still happen, but now you meet them with awareness. Not every emotional surge becomes a reaction. Not every wound becomes a war. Sometimes, the most powerful response is to stay rooted, to breathe through the reflex, to witness your own rise without collapsing into it. Because the trigger isn't always the threat. Often it's the teacher. The wound being touched is old. The person in front of you is just holding a mirror. And when you stay long enough in that reflection without fleeing, you heal. Not by erasing the pain, but by integrating it. This is what Jung meant by shadow work, reclaiming the parts of you you've disowned. The ones you were told were too much, too sensitive, too emotional. You no longer exile those parts, you bring them home, and in doing so, you become whole. That wholeness isn't a performance. It's a quiet, unwavering presence. You no longer need to explain your transformation. You simply live it. You move slower. You listen deeper. You choose more wisely. You hold yourself with more compassion than the world ever did. You learn that real boundaries don't require announcements. They're felt. Real alignment doesn't need convincing. It's embodied. And real self-love isn't loud. It's consistent. This is when your external world starts to shift. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped settling. You stopped leaking your light into unworthy containers. You stopped chasing energy that only confused your nervous system. You came home to yourself. And from that home, you begin to create. You no longer cope, you compose. You don't hustle for belonging, you attract resonance. You don't fear solitude, you welcome it. Because solitude is no longer emptiness, it's presence. And from presence, you find your power again. Not the power to control others, but to direct yourself. Not to dominate the room, but to anchor it. Not to outshine, but to illuminate. This is the self you are always becoming. The one buried under people-pleasing, perfectionism, and pain. The one who doesn't chase, perform, or pretend. The one who moves with clarity, speaks with care, and lives from the inside out. You finally understand. The performance was never your truth. The mask was never your face. The over-explanation was never your language. Your truth lives in your being. Your presence is enough. Your silence is sacred. Your no is holy. You don't need permission to exist in peace. You've stopped shrinking. You've stopped apologizing. You've stopped explaining what only experience can reveal. And now you walk differently. You speak differently. You take up space like you were always meant to. Not for show, but from truth. Not everyone will understand it, but that was never the point. You're no longer here to be interpreted. You're here to be whole.